may recall as one of the early converts that joined the church in Ohio. Parley P. Pratt is credited with teaching and baptizing him. Sidney Rigdon had been a preacher at one point of the Baptist Church, the Campbellite faith, and even his own version of what the gospel was about. Sidney had many different congregations in Ohio. One historian claims that he had as many as 17 different congregations. So in some effect, the baptism of Sidney Rigdon was almost like the baptism of a King Lamoni. When Sidney joined, many in Ohio followed suit. So when we talk about Sidney Rigdon, we're talking about an early convert. We're talking about a scribe for Joseph Smith as Joseph worked on the revisions that he made on the Bible. We're also talking about a man that had seen in vision, section 76 in the Doctrine and Covenants, the vision of glories. We're also talking about a man that at one point was in the first presidency of the church. However, in Nauvoo, before Joseph's death, as the names were being read off of church leaders for sustaining vote, as the first presidency names were being read off, the name of Sidney Rigdon was read aloud. As it had been read, Joseph Smith stood up and he said that he didn't want Sidney Rigdon as his counselor anymore. To the discredit of the saints, they voted against the prophet and concluded that Sidney had the right to remain as Joseph's prophet. Joseph had stood up in that meeting and said, "You give me Sidney Rigdon, I throw him back at you." So now we look at the man that forms the first apostate church after the death of Joseph. For Sidney Rigdon, at the death of Joseph, although he was in name only a counselor in the first presidency of the church, he had moved to a place called Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He claimed while in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on June 27, 1844, about the very same time, 5 in the evening, that Joseph was being shot, as well as Joseph's brother Hiram, that an angel came to visit him. Now, if I were to say, did Sidney make a mistake? He forgot you're supposed to shake hands. Okay, in addition to probably several other things, he's definitely on the outs. So, Sidney Rigdon, as the angel appeared to him, and I have no doubt that he had some kind of experience, the angel told him that Joseph was dead and that there was chaos in the streets of Nauvoo, which invariably there was, and that Sidney was to hurry from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to go to Nauvoo, and there he was to tell the saints that they needed to move from Nauvoo to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that would be the new gathering place of the church, and that Sidney, instead of being a counselor to Joseph, was now going to be the guardian of the church, meaning that there would never be another Joseph Smith, and that Sidney would then guard the church, and that when Christ came in a millennial reign, that Christ would have on his right hand Joseph Smith. Sidney would then hand the keys, whatever he possessed, to the prophet Joseph. Joseph would then hand them to Christ, and the millennium would begin. As a result of whatever happened to Sidney, whether it was an angel or perhaps some other being, Sidney now hurried his way to Nauvoo to spread his lies. As he did so, you can imagine Nauvoo and surrounding area is, it's a large community. Nauvoo itself, at one point by 1843, was even rivaling Chicago in size. Now, if you count Nauvoo and all the little small communities around it on the Iowa side and then leading towards Carthage, you're looking at probably somewhere around 20,000 people. Obviously, Sidney can't talk to each one individually, and so he set a date that he invited all church members to come to the East Grove by the Nauvoo Temple, which by this point was about 1.5 stories high. And there Sidney would talk to the majority of the saints, those that could crowd in, and tell them about the angel, the guardianship, and everyone was to pack up and to move to Pittsburgh. Now, his meeting was set for August 8, 1844. We leave Sydney with a pending meeting, and we turn our attention now to Brigham Young. Brigham Young, as were now all 10 members of the Quorum of the 12, with the other two, John Taylor and Willard Richards in Nauvoo, Brigham Young was serving a mission in Boston. The very day that Joseph Smith died, he was in a railroad depot with a man named Wilford Woodruff. Both of them felt so sad and depressed, but they couldn't figure out why they felt so sad, that they didn't want to talk to each other. They just sat there, as both felt a sense of gloom but didn't know what was going on. Now notice, that's June 27th. By July 9th, Brigham Young has heard a rumor that Joseph and Hiram are dead, and that they died 2 weeks ago. He brushes it off as just one of those ill rumors that's always flying around about the prophet. However, on July 16th, he reads a detailed letter of the martyrdom. As he does so, he's with another apostle whose name is Orson Pratt. Both of them vent their feelings with a great sense of sorrow. As they did so, at one point Brigham Young slapped his leg and said, "We have the keys for bearing off the kingdom." In other words, Joseph didn't take them with him, and that the 12 then had the authority to lead the church. Both men now hurried back to Nauvoo. Brigham Young arrived back August 6th, in other words, 2 days before Sidney Rigdon's proposed speech there at the East Grove by the temple. As Brigham went back, he held a meeting of the Quorum of the 12 at the home of John Taylor to discuss what was going on. As they discussed, and each man realized that they had the keys to, quote, bear off the kingdom, for the first time, Brigham Young will learn that Sidney is back and that Sidney has seen an angel. Brigham Young's surprised. He doesn't believe Sidney's seen anything. And so his conclusion was, the next day, he held a meeting on August 7th. As he held the meeting, he invited all the high priests of Nauvoo to come. All seemed to agree that the Quorum of the 12 had the right to bear off the kingdom. The next day was August 8th. It was Sunday. It was rainy. It was pretty cold. But nevertheless, thousands now gathered in to that East Grove by the temple to listen to a man at one point who had been a spokesman for the prophet Joseph, to listen to a man that still believed the first presidency was intact. As Sidney Rigdon stood to speak to the congregation, between the howling wind and the elements, no one could hear him. There wasn't a PA system like we have here in the Marriott Center. People couldn't hear what this great speaker had to say. They said to Sidney, "Go to the back of the group, we'll flip over a wagon, and tell us from the back of the wagon who's to lead the church." Well, Sidney did that. He spoke for about an hour and a half, most accounts say. As he spoke, people would turn to look at him, and then they would turn back. Finally, it was now time for Brigham Young to speak. Brigham Young had listened to Sidney. He knew that everything he had said was false. Brigham Young stood up. He attempted to walk to the back of the congregation to also speak from the top of the wagon. However, the wind died down. The people said, "Brigham, come forward. We want to be able to see you. We want to be able to hear you." Now, Brigham Young stood about somewhere on a good day between about 5'9" and 5'10". He had red hair, he had freckles, and pretty much the temperament that went with that kind of look. Brigham Young now came to the front where there was a kind of makeshift podium. As he stood to address the people, there was a literal gasp. What was happening to Brigham? He looked like, he sounded like the prophet Joseph Smith. Journal entry after journal entry says, "I heard Joseph." Who had these people been missing? They'd missed the prophet Joseph Smith. Some, Orson Hyde, Benjamin F. Johnson, wrote that not only was it Joseph's voice, but it was Joseph's voice even down to the whistle, where Joseph had had a tooth chipped out during the tarring and feathering and hadn't got it fixed. until 1843 by the dentist in town, and Alexander Nybar. And so they could hear the whistle from his voice.